Hi, my name is Robert Greving, and I'm a teacher at the Heights School in Potomac, Maryland. I teach Latin and grammar in the middle school. And the webinar I'm giving this afternoon is entitled Pride and Prejudice, a Moral Education for Marriage. And in a talk such as this, I believe I have an advantage in that I'm among friends, people who usually come into things with Jane Austen, about Jane Austen, don't have an axe to grind. So this talk is going to be more about sort of comparing notes with things. And I'm going to give you my comments on things, and I hope later to hear your comments on them as well. I'm going to start by giving a brief overview of Miss Austen's life and her works, with a little appreciation of her works, and then a synopsis of most of the plot of Pride and Prejudice. And then I shall cover three major themes in the book: self-knowledge, respect, and love. And then I'll tie all these together into a moral education for marriage. The last part of this talk then will be a brief appreciation of her work. So a while ago, a friend asked me, what is a good definition of a story, or what makes a good story? And I thought that was a very good question, and I don't know if I have a definitive answer, but the answer that works for me is that a good story is one that instructs and entertains. And the more it entertains, kind of the better it instructs. And I think that's why I've been so captivated by the novels of Jane Austen. The more I read them, the more I'm entertained by them, and the more I'm instructed by them. I never finish one of her novels without many a good chuckle, as well as a deeper understanding of myself, of others, of what it means to be human, and without perhaps wanting to be a better person as well. Lord David Cecil, a biographer of Jane Austen, once put it this way: if I were in doubt as to the wisdom of one of my actions, I should not consult Flaubert or Dostoevsky. The opinion of Balzac or Dickens would carry little weight with me. Were Stendhal to rebuke me, it would only convince me I had done right. Even in the judgment of Tolstoy, I should not put complete confidence. But I should be seriously upset. I should worry for weeks and weeks if I incurred the disapproval of Jane Austen. First, a little bit about Jane Austen. She was born in 1775 and died in 1817. She was the seventh of 8 children and the younger of 2 daughters of an obscure country curate. A curate is a clergyman of the Anglican Church. She only had 3 formal years of education, and she wrote 6 novels, 2 of which went unpublished during her life. She never married, and as far as we know, had only 1 offer of marriage. She took her Anglican faith very seriously, even composing some prayers for herself. 2 of her brothers served in the Royal Navy, and 1 attained the rank of Admiral of the Fleet. So it was pretty much a humdrum life, and I think that's good for her. She's like most of us. And the same can be said of her novels. There's nothing really extraordinary in them. During most of her life, England was at war with France during the Napoleonic Wars, but except for the novel Persuasion, the wars hardly figure in any of her works. In one sense, the criticism of her books is true. Her novels are about small-town gossip, family friction, heartaches, heartbreaks, worrying about the kids, and trying to provide for the family, and of course, marriage. And again, I would say that that's a good thing. She is like most of us. That's where most of us lived. She once described her novels as, quote, the little bit 2 inches wide of ivory on which I work with so fine a brush as produces so little effect after so much labor. This, though, I think is part of her genius. Where else are we to learn virtue except in the ordinary course of our typically humdrum lives, with the family gossip, the heartaches, the friction, and all the rest? Now, of course, the plot of most of her novels centers around marriage. And why shouldn't it? There are few things more common and at the same time more momentous than marriage. For most of us, it is the decision that we make in our lives. Those that say that love and marriage are not serious topics for a novel speak more about themselves, and to their detriment, I think, than they do about Jane Austen. I should, though, qualify this. While her novels are about marriage, They're never about marriage in and of itself, or marriage just for its own sake. Rather, they're about marriage for characters who struggle to be worthy of or to make the right type of marriage. Some do and some don't. Now, that brings me to Pride and Prejudice. Miss Austen held the view, and I think it's safe to say, that what determines one's happiness in life is character. As Elizabeth Bennet will put it to her sister Jane upon Jane's engagement, until I have your disposition and your goodness, I can never have your happiness. The fact that one's happiness depends upon one's character is surely countercultural today. And it's the idea of character that I want to talk about. Perhaps one definition of character could be who one is, as opposed to who one thinks he is, or who one holds himself out to be. When the Greeks built their temple to Apollo at Delphi, they inscribed above it not a prayer, not some utterance of the gods, or not a command from the gods, but rather a simple maxim, gnothe se auton, which translates into know thyself. That's where character begins and ends, and it's where happiness begins and ends, and it's also a recurrent theme in most of Jane Austen's novels. Now, the plot of Pride and Prejudice is simple enough. It concerns Elizabeth Bennet, who is the second eldest of 5 daughters of a humorously, albeit tragically, mismatched couple, and the Fitzwilliam Darcy, a wealthy upper-class young man. Elizabeth at first despises Darcy for his arrogance and his meddling in the affection of his best friend Bingley's attraction to Elizabeth's sister Jane, and for his supposedly unjust behavior to Wickham, who is a soldier in the local militia that Elizabeth is attracted to, and who had been a protege of Darcy's father. Darcy, for his part, is attracted to Elizabeth because of her lively mind, her frankness, her evident care for others, but he is also repelled by her family, especially her boorish mother and frivolous young sisters. Nevertheless, Darcy proposes to Elizabeth and expects a joyful acceptance, and he's sadly mistaken. Elizabeth lets him know in no uncertain terms that not only will she not marry him, but that she never could marry him. She attacks his character and his integrity. He, in turn, strikes back by laying bare the faults of her family, as well as her vanity. And so there we are. Such candidness between people is rarely overcome. The pride and prejudice of each character towards the other has not only been formed, but has also been declared openly. How will these two ever come together? How can pride and prejudice be overcome? Well, first, we should define these terms, pride and prejudice. They need not be wholly bad. If we take pride to mean a just appreciation of one's duties and one's abilities, then perhaps we could all do with a little bit more of it. In fact, this is a spoiler alert, Elizabeth will say towards the end of the novel that Darcy has no improper pride. Where it leads to trouble is in the overestimating of oneself in those, the overestimating of oneself in these, okay? And prejudice also can sometimes have a negative meaning as well. And it depends again upon how we're going to use that term. If by prejudice we mean the judgment without reflection or without any proper basis, then it does come to be a bad thing. However, if by prejudging something we mean by having ideas formed or good ideas thought out in advance, then perhaps it is a good thing. Elizabeth, for example, will have judgments formed already as to what is proper in terms of behavior or one's own abilities. And in some of the most humorous scenes in the novel regarding Mr. Collins, she rightly makes good prejudgments on him in his superciliousness and his obsequiousness towards other characters. Now, in the novel, Darcy proposes to Elizabeth and she rejects him. And this is a great blow to Darcy's pride and his vanity. He responds by writing a letter to her and delivering it to her the next day. And in that letter, he lays bare his reasons for why he behaved, why he interfered in Bingley's relationship with Jane, Elizabeth's sister, and why he also had his concerns about Elizabeth's family, and then also why he explains his behavior to Wickham more fully to Elizabeth. Now, with that, Darcy reveals some things about himself and his family history. As far as his behavior towards Elizabeth's sister Jane, Darcy simply says that he was honestly just trying to protect his friend. And as for Wickham, Darcy reveals in that letter that he had long known Wickham to be a dissolute young man, and that one time Wickham had even tried to seduce Darcy's younger sister, Georgiana, in order to wound Darcy and get at Georgiana's fortune. And this letter that Darcy writes to Elizabeth after she rejects him is a turning point in the novel, and it's noteworthy in a few respects. The first thing is that in those days, an unmarried man usually did not write a letter to an unmarried woman unless they had what was termed an understanding, which means an agreement to get married or an engagement. And this is the reason for Frank Churchill and Jane Fairfax and Emma to conceal their correspondence, because they don't want people to think that they have any kind of understanding. And it's the reason why in Sense and Sensibility that people believe that Marianne Dashwood is engaged because of her letters to Willoughby in that novel. Excuse me. Okay, excuse me. I just have to get something together here. Okay. So when Darcy writes this letter to Elizabeth as an unmarried man writing to an unmarried woman, he is breaking a convention, and that's a daring step for one who is so concerned about his own position and his own pride. And secondly, it's interesting that Darcy does this at all. True, he does it to clear his character, and one could take this as another aspect of his pride. But he has never revealed these matters before to anyone, especially the information about Wickham trying to seduce his younger sister. And not even to his closest friends has he told this. He obviously cares so much about Elizabeth and what Elizabeth thinks of him that he is willing to disclose a family scandal. Now, why does he care so much about Elizabeth's opinion? Because she is honest and she does not flatter. That is one of the strengths of her character, one of the reasons that he's attracted to her. And it's arguable as to whether, and because she is like that, because she's a very sincere, frank person, Darcy cares so much for her opinion. In one of the lines that occurs when they are having their argument after he proposes to her and she rejects him, Darcy will say that a disguise of every sort is his abhorrence. He loves and he really appreciates that openness and frankness with Elizabeth, and so he cares very much about her opinion because of that. The opinion of a person who's very sincere and very honest is priceless, and it's something we all want to have. So that's why he writes this letter to her, because her opinion means so much to him. The other thing that's noteworthy about the letter is that in fact it is a letter. All right, it is, I believe, in the novel, the longest communication between Darcy and Elizabeth that takes place. Now, a letter is important because it allows for reflection. When Darcy gives this letter to Elizabeth, she takes it and at first she reads through it hurriedly, but then she has to take the time to read it and reread it again. Now, it's arguable whether Elizabeth would have given Darcy in person the attention that she does give this letter. She'll read it several times, and because she has to read it, and because it's there in black and white, and she can reread it, she's almost forced to reflect on what Darcy is saying. And she's almost forced then to look at her actions and what happened in a more objective manner. And it's this reflection that it is in this reflection that Elizabeth starts to learn humility. Humility is truth, the truth about ourselves and the truth about others. And it often hurts and it's often painful. One reason it's difficult to recognize and admit our faults is that our faults are often mirror images of our virtues, sort of the other side of the coin, as it were. For example, if we look at Elizabeth, well, she is intelligent, and she does have very good judgment. The problem is she places too much confidence in her judgment, and she's never had anyone to check her judgment on things as well. And so she's never had that balance of being shown wrong. She overestimates her abilities and her judgment and her behavior in these things. The same thing with Darcy. He is a man of good birth, a man of wealth, a man who's intelligent, but he overestimates that, and he disdains people or can have a bad opinion of those who aren't like that. For example, his decisive character misreads the softer, gentler feelings of a person such as Jane, Elizabeth's sister. All right? Another characteristic of Elizabeth, as I said, is her good sense in judging others. And it's exactly that reason why she's so harsh on her friend Charlotte Lucas, because when Charlotte Lucas accepts the proposal of Mr. Collins in the novel, Elizabeth knows that Charlotte is using very improper judgment and is just being foolish with the whole thing. So, but where Elizabeth's good judgment gets out of hand is when she trusts it too much. She will fail, for example, to see Wickham's lack of propriety in gossiping about Darcy behind his back. And it will blind her for a time to Darcy's estimation of her family's behavior. She does not and will not allow herself to appreciate Darcy's true character because she places too much trust in her own good judgment. As I said, Darcy as well comes from a distinguished and good family. These are very important, and management of money in marriage is a sizable ingredient in happiness. And whether we like it or not, when you marry somebody, you marry that person's family. So Darcy is justly and rightly concerned about Elizabeth's family. As I said, Darcy's interference in Bingley's attraction to Jane is done from the best motives of friendship as well. He is a good friend to Bingley. And even his own attraction to Elizabeth shows very good judgment. But Darcy, too, gets carried away by his own ideas, and he trusts himself too much. His self-seriousness is pride and keeps him in a very limited social circle, which is never a good thing. His concern for his family's position causes him to hide Wickham's true character with disastrous consequences. As I said before, his own decisive character misread Jane Bennet's quiet but deep feelings for his friend Bingley. So it's only humility that can overcome the pride and prejudice of these two and bring them to the respect that makes for a happy marriage. Humility, as the saying goes, comes from humiliations. As these two have placed so much pride in their judgments, it is their respective judgments that must be shown to be wrong. And this can only be done when one is forced to face the facts. As one Austen scholar has noted, quote, like St. Augustine, they, the Austen heroines, must confess their past transgressions before they can move on to a wiser and more blessed life. And Darcy's letter forces Elizabeth to do just that. At first, she still cannot believe him and his disclosures about Wickham's past infamous behavior. Then, however, she reflects, and it's in reflecting on how Wickham behaved, as opposed to what he said, that she begins to see that Darcy must be right, and Wickham and herself must be wrong. As the philosopher Joseph Pieper has put it in quoting St. Thomas Aquinas, true to being memory is the perfection of prudence. Judgment is an art. It's not a set of rules. It comes from reflection and self-examination. It comes from looking at facts from what has happened as opposed to what we would like to have happen. With Elizabeth, it was a humiliation, but that humiliation begins to save her. In a passage worth quoting at length, she comes to terms with her pride and her prejudice. Quote, "How despicably have I acted," she cried. "I, who have prided myself on my discernment. I, who have valued myself on my abilities, who have often disdained the generous candor of my sister and gratified my vanity in useless or blamable distrust. How humiliating is this discovery, yet how just a humiliation. Had I been in love, I could not have behaved more wretchedly blind. I could not have been more wretchedly blind. But vanity and not love has been my folly. Pleased with the preference of one and offended by the neglect of the other, on the very beginning of our acquaintance, I have courted prepossession, which is prejudice, and ignorance, and have driven reason away where either was concerned. Till this moment, I never knew myself." Now, have any of us ever had such a moment? And if we have, what have we done with it? We have to remember that the character who speaks these lines is not in any way weak or self-indulgent or stupid or pitiable, but on the contrary, one of the strongest and most intelligent heroines in all of literature, one who turns down in no uncertain terms, not one, but two highly advantageous proposals, and one who goes head to head with the formidable Lady Catherine de Bourgh and comes out on top. Clearly, facing humiliations, far from being a weakness, requires great strength. A few things to note about this passage. First is the line, "How humiliating is this discovery, yet how just a humiliation." We've all had humiliations. How many of us, though, have admitted that they were just? And then Elizabeth says, "Had I been in love, I could not have been more blind." We have the expression, "love is blind," and this usually, I believe, is taken to mean that we do not see the faults of the one we love. But does this not come first from a blindness about our own faults, through our own self-love? We're blind about others precisely because we have so much trust in our judgment. Why did Elizabeth not see Wickham for who he was? Why was she not open to the honest possibility of Darcy's earlier criticisms of Wickham? And not only because of her preference for Wickham, but because of her own self-love, which is what pride is, and her uncritical trust in herself. I hate to speak ill of a Jane Austen heroine, but there it is. Another noteworthy point in this is her admission that she has courted prepossession and ignorance. Prepossession, as I said before, is another word for prejudice. We must admit that there are times when we want to be prejudiced, want to be ignorant of what really happened. Why? Because otherwise we should have to face some uncomfortable facts, especially about ourselves. As Miss Austen herself said in one of her letters, "I do not want people to be very agreeable, as it saves me the trouble of liking them a great deal." And it's in perhaps those very areas that we are most sure of ourselves that we need to be most cautious. In another of her letters, Miss Austen is debating a course of action. And then she concludes by saying, quote, "Where so many hours have been spent in convincing myself that I am right, is there not some reason to fear I may be wrong?" Much to think about there. And finally, I shall quote an evening prayer that Miss Austen composed for herself, which reads in part, "Teach us to understand the sinfulness of our own hearts, and to bring to our knowledge every fault of temper and envy and every evil habit which we have indulged in to the discomfort of our fellow creatures and the danger of our own souls. O God, save us from deceiving ourselves by pride or vanity." It seems that the dangers of self-deception, this danger of self-deception was one with which Jane Austen herself wrestled with. And it's also very much at odds with today's notion of follow your heart. Excuse me. Now, to return to Elizabeth. From the realization of her own pride regarding Wickham, Elizabeth comes to recognize the justice of Darcy's criticism of the behavior and not the social standing of her family. Quote, "Her sense of shame was severe. The justice of the charge struck her too forcibly for denial." Close quote. So truth, especially about oneself and those that one loves, often hurts. Now, another point for Darcy's redemption comes when Elizabeth recollects that Bingley, whose good character has never been questioned throughout the novel, is Darcy's friend. Wickham, she recalls, has no friends. He does have his fellow officers in the regiment, but they seem to like him for the same easy manners that others have liked him for, and not for any intrinsic merit in himself. She remembers that in earlier meetings, Darcy has talked affectionately of his younger sister, Georgiana, and his letter conveyed similar sentiments about his father. How one's friends and one's family and how one speaks of them says a great deal about one's character. Now, there's no immediate rapprochement between Elizabeth and Darcy after this letter. In fact, the relationship seems still irrevocably broken. It is one thing to turn down a man because he is arrogant and presumptuous, and quite another to realize that you've just done him one better in those respects. Besides, for humiliations to become humility, it takes time. While Elizabeth can disclose some of what she has learned to Jane, her sister, much of it she must suffer in silence. Her new knowledge of Wickham's character and what the unbridled behavior of her sisters, especially Lydia, has cost the family, will lead her to counsel her father against letting Lydia go to Brighton when the regiment moves there. And her father rebuffs her. This will hurt Elizabeth very much, and it will hurt more when she is shown to be right. Later, though, while on a summer tour with her uncle and Aunt Gardner, Elizabeth has the opportunity to visit Darcy's family estate, Pemberley, to be sure while Darcy is away, or at least he's supposed to be. And this is another turning point in the novel. She will say later, when questioned by her sister Jane, when did she first realize her love for Darcy? Quote, "It's been coming on so gradually that I hardly know when it began, but I believe I must date it from my first seeing his beautiful grounds at Pemberley," close quote. While Elizabeth is being a little playful with that, she need not be entirely so, nor need this remark make her seem mercenary or shallow. Miss Austen describes Elizabeth's tour of Darcy's estate in a passage which is unusually long for her when dealing with houses and grounds. Landscape architecture and home decor were, and still are in a sense, good indicators of a person's taste and personality. In short, one might say of a person's view of culture. In Pemberley, Elizabeth will say that she had never seen a place for which nature had done more, or where natural beauty had been so little counteracted by awkward taste. The house, too, was neither gaudy nor uselessly fine, with less of splendor and more real elegance. Grace, as St. Thomas says, works with nature, it does not destroy it. At Pemberley, Elizabeth will also meet a servant of Darcy's who will speak of him in glowing terms, praising his kindness and his liberality with those on the estate, while admitting that he does not rattle on like other young men. Elizabeth asks herself, what praise is more valuable than the praise of an intelligent servant? At that point, Darcy, to Elizabeth's great mortification, arrives unexpectedly at the estate. Yet Darcy, too, at this point has changed. He goes to great lengths at this point in the novel to please Elizabeth and to attend to her and to her aunt and uncle. He introduces his sister to them. He invites them to dinner at Pemberley. The fact that he has learned, or at least is starting to learn, his lesson in humility is not lost on Elizabeth, and brings on another aspect of love that is seldom considered these days. Yes, Elizabeth grows in her respect and esteem for Darcy, quote, but above all, above respect and esteem, there was a motive within her of goodwill, which could not be overlooked. It was gratitude. Gratitude not merely for having once loved her, but for loving her still well enough to forgive all the petulance and acrimony of her manners in rejecting him, and all the unjust accusations accompanying her rejection. Notice that she admits herself to have been unjust towards Darcy. And also note that Elizabeth does not expect Darcy to renew his love for her. This belief will be further strengthened by later events. So, getting back to Darcy now, he too has had his humiliation. He's recognized that although admired by those who know him, his pride and his own social position had kept him in a station where few, if any, would speak to him with any openness or candor. He needed it, though, and Elizabeth gave it to him. He will later tell her, "I was spoilt by my parents, who, though good themselves, my father particularly, all that was benevolent and amiable, allowed, encouraged, and almost taught me to be selfish and overbearing, and to care for none beyond my own family circle. To think meanly, that is disdainfully, of all the rest of the world, to wish, at least, to think meanly of their sense and worth compared with my own. You taught me a lesson, hard indeed at first, but most advantageous. By you I was properly humbled. I came to you without a doubt of my reception. You showed me how insufficient were all my pretensions to please a woman worthy of being pleased. Blessed is the man who can say of his fiancée or of his wife, by you I was properly humbled." So both Elizabeth and Darcy have gained self-knowledge. And while it is important that each is humbled, it's more important that each realizes the truth in the humiliation. Still, more for their happiness, each comes to a greater respect, even gratitude for the other because of this recognition. So often when another person confronts us with our faults, it's a long time, if ever, that we acknowledge the justice of the criticism and learn from it, and are grateful to the person who made us face ourselves. That type of gratitude is a heroic step in virtue. If the lessons have been learned, though, they must be tested. And this occurs in the novel when, the day after having dined at Pemberley, and Darcy having exhibited toward Elizabeth and the Gardiners the amiability he has started to learn, Elizabeth will receive a letter. In the letter, she is told of Lydia's elopement, and seduction may be a better word, by Wickham. Darcy comes upon her while she's still in shock from the news. He listens, he offers condolences, and then he leaves. Elizabeth is shattered. She hurts for her family because of the disgrace that this will bring to them. She hurts especially for Jane, her sister, because this will surely turn Bingley away from her forever. As the events unfold, however, Elizabeth will bear the brunt of her family's humiliation more than anyone. Perhaps even more so than her father, because she realizes, more than anyone, the pain of her earlier false judgment of Darcy and Wickham. But it is important to note that there is no self-pity. She never believes that Darcy will renew his acquaintances with her or his addresses to her, even after Lydia and Wickham will get married. Darcy, too, will keep quiet about his role in bringing about that marriage. Virtue in Elizabeth and Darcy's case, the virtue of their own self-knowledge, must be its own reward. Elizabeth later does discover Darcy's role in bringing about the marriage of Lydia and Wickham, thanks to Lydia's sort of happy fault, if you will, of her loose tongue. But this will only increase her respect for Darcy. She will confront Darcy about this, but only out of gratitude. She confesses that he, in his turn, will confess that he did what he did only out of gratitude to her. And this gratitude, out of respect for one another, allows them to express their love. Once the humility and judgment, respect and gratitude are in place, then the couple can be worthy of a good marriage. Without humility, judgment, and respect, marriage and family life cannot be happy, as is shown in another part of the novel describing the marriage of Elizabeth's parents. Quote, "Had Elizabeth's opinion all been drawn from her own family, she could not have formed a very pleasing picture of conjugal felicity or domestic comfort. Her father, captivated by youth and beauty and that appearance of good humor which youth and beauty generally give, had married a woman whose weak understanding and illiberal, that is, selfish, mind had very early in their marriage put an end to all real affection for her. Respect, esteem, and confidence had vanished forever, and all his views of domestic happiness were overthrown. She had always seen it with pain, but respecting her father's abilities and grateful for his affectionate treatment of herself, She endeavored to forget what she could not overlook, and to banish from her thoughts that continual breach of conjugal obligation and decorum, which, in exposing his wife to the contempt of her own children, was so highly reprehensible. But she had never felt so strongly as now the disadvantage which must attend the children of so unsuitable a marriage. Mr. Bennet himself will poignantly admit this when he later counsels Elizabeth, "Let me never have the misfortune of seeing you being unhappy and not respecting your partner in marriage." Note that in that passage, Miss Austen does not mention love. Does this mean that she did not think that love was important in marriage? To the contrary, it was essential. But for love to be what it ought to be in marriage, it must be based upon respect, esteem, and confidence. If love is based upon youth and beauty, and that appearance of good humor which youth and beauty generally give, then unhappiness is only a matter of time. As an aside, this is also why Elizabeth is so harsh on Charlotte Lucas when she accepts Mr. Collins. Elizabeth knows that there's no respect, and therefore that there cannot be any love, either at the time of their engagement or in the future. Her later visit to Charlotte will only confirm the sad prospects of that marriage. And secondly, there is the recognition in this passage of the effects upon the children of a marriage in which respect, esteem, and confidence are lacking. If the parents do not respect each other, it can hardly be surprising that the children do not respect the parents. None of the Bennet sisters holds their mother in high esteem, and Jane and Elizabeth only have some respect for their father because he has provided for them and been affectionate to them. Lydia's flirtatious and in the end shameful behavior is not surprising given Mr. Bennet's detached relationship with her. We must also remember that Elizabeth's feelings for Darcy start to undergo the transformation when she has been with her uncle and Aunt Gardner, who are the only happily married couple in the book, at least until the end. So for Miss Austen, what makes a good marriage is not love in the modern sense, which is feelings or looks or easygoing compatibility. It depends upon words which are awkward to modern ears, especially regarding marriage. Words such as judgment, understanding, respect, discernment, prudence, and gratitude. It depends a great deal upon self-knowledge, especially of one's own faults, and upon humility, usually painfully acquired. Excuse me. Now, I began this talk by saying that Miss Austen's stories are good because they both instruct and entertain. I've spent much time on the instruction, but let's not forget that they do entertain. I always finish these novels with a smile. It is a great part of Miss Austen's genius that she can deliver such valuable lessons so pleasantly. Someone once said that of all great authors, Miss Austen is the one most difficult to catch in the act of greatness. If you've read these novels, especially Pride and Prejudice or Emma, have you ever felt that you were being taught or being preached at? Miss Austen would be the last one to want that. For the great fault of Elizabeth and Darcy, and the great fault of Pride and Prejudice, is to take oneself too seriously. As G.K. Chesterton, who greatly admired Jane Austen, once said, "Satan fell by force of gravity." What better friend can we have than the one who tells us our faults with a twinkle in his or her eye? I shall end this part of the talk now with a quote from the book of Proverbs, which is inscribed on a marble tablet by Miss Austen's tomb in Winchester Cathedral. The quote goes, "She opened her mouth in wisdom, and in her tongue is the law of kindness."